United States emerged from World War II as one of the foremost economic, political, and military powers in the world. Wartime production pulled the economy out of the Depression and propelled it to great profits. In the interest of avoiding another global war, for the first time the United States began to use economic assistance as a strategic element of its foreign policy and offered significant assistance to countries in Europe and Asia struggling to rebuild their shattered economies. As the Soviets demonstrated a strong interest in dominating Eastern Europe, the United States took the lead in forming a Western alliance to counterbalance the communist superpower to contain the spread of communism. At the same time, the United States restructured its military and intelligence forces, both of which would have a significant influence in U.S. Cold War policy. There were two major differences between the two countries even before World War II started. They had drastically different political and economic systems. The United States has an economic system known as capitalism, where private citizens own property, businesses, and control the economic activity. The Soviet Union has an economic system known as communism, where the government owned the property, businesses, and controlled all economic activities. They want the workers of the world to unite and revolt against their own governments to install communist systems around the globe. The political system of the United States is known as a federal republic with democracy. We elect our leaders. The political system of the Soviet Union was known as a totalitarian dictatorship, where one person or small group of people have total control of every aspect of their society. President Truman of the US wanted a free and democratic Europe. Joseph Stalin wanted to spread communism and believed that war with the West was unavoidable. Stalin wanted to create a buffer zone between the USSR and Western Europe so that they could stop future invasions from the West. He installed communist governments in the countries of Eastern Europe, shown on the map, and controlled them. These are known as satellite nations, countries that depended on and were dominated by the USSR. Truman knew he had to do something about the Soviet threat and created a policy of containment to stop the spread of communism to other countries. This will be the official policy towards the spread of communism throughout the entire Cold War. This will be the reason why we get into two major wars. It will also be one of the reasons why we will support dictators and other countries or democracies around the world. As long as they don't support the Soviet Union, we will support them. In one of the most famous speeches of the Cold War period, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill condemns the Soviet Union's policies in Europe and declares, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent." Churchill's speech is considered the opening of the Cold War. The Iron Curtain was a political boundary dividing Europe into two separate blocks. In blue on the map, the Western Bloc represents countries that were either NATO members, neutral, or allied with the United States. In red on the map, the Eastern Bloc represents countries that were connected or influenced by the Soviet Union. The Eastern Bloc nations represented a buffer zone, as Stalin wanted to keep the West from invading the Soviet Union. After establishing control over Eastern Europe, Stalin attempts to spread communism to Greece and Turkey next. Because of this threat, President Truman argued that aid should be sent to any nation trying to stop communism from taking over. It became known as the Truman Doctrine. Greece and Turkey were the first countries to receive aid under this policy. They got over $400 million between 1947 and 1950. Here's an excerpt from his speech. Quote, "I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures." End quote. Western Europe was in terrible economic shape after World War II. This meant that their governments were open to threats from communist parties within their own countries. To help these governments resist a communist takeover, the U.S. gave economic aid to any country that needed it. The Marshall Plan, named after our Secretary of State George Marshall, sent over $13 billion in aid to rebuild Western Europe. By 1952, most of the Western European countries were flourishing, and the Communist Party had lost most of its appeal. The containment policy had worked in Western Europe. Look at the chart. Notice that the United Kingdom, or Great Britain, and France received the most aid under the Marshall Plan. This is because they are our closest allies and were badly damaged by Germany during the war. You should also notice the former members of the Axis powers received aid too. This was to prevent communism from spreading to these new democracies. Eastern European countries were offered aid by the US, but the Soviet Union turned them down and stripped those countries of their resources and sent them back to the Soviet Union. It will take decades for European nations in the East to recover from the devastation of World War II. The Allies had to decide what to do with Germany after the war. At the Potsdam Conference, they drew up a plan to divide up Germany. The USSR wanted to keep Germany weak and divided, so they split up Germany into 4 zones, each occupied by a World War II ally. The USSR occupied the East German zone. The United Kingdom occupied the Northwestern zone. The US occupied the Central zone, and France occupied the Western zone. Berlin, the capital of Germany, was divided in the same way, even though it was in the heart of the Soviet-occupied East German zone. The Western Allies thought that Europe would be more stable if Germany were united and productive. They combined their zones and created the new country known as West Germany. They did the same to Berlin. The Soviet Union responded by blockading or cutting off all transportation in or out of the Allied-occupied West Berlin. The Soviet Union said it would hold West Berlin hostage until the West gave up the idea of German reunification. The US and Britain responded by starting the Berlin airlift. For 327 days, the Allies brought food and supplies from the air. The Western Allies still had their World War II military forces in West Germany. The Soviets also had their military forces in East Germany. Fearing the start of World War III, the Soviet Union finally gave up and took down the blockade of West Berlin. The US and her allies had just won the first confrontation in the Cold War without a shot being fired. One result of the Soviet blockade of West Berlin was the creation of NATO, a defensive military alliance involving the US, Canada, and 10 European countries. In its charter, they state that an attack on one country in NATO is an attack on every country in NATO. The purpose of this alliance was collective security, that the Soviet Union would think twice about attacking any one of those countries. The U.S. had begun to modernize its military capability in 1947 by passing the National Security Act. It created, number one, a centralized Department of Defense, formerly known as the War Department, to coordinate the operations of the Army, Navy, and Air Force. Number two, the creation of a National Security Council to coordinate the making of foreign policy in the Cold War. And number three, the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, to employ the spies to gather information on foreign governments. In 1948, the Selective Service System and a peacetime draft were instituted. An arms race occurs when 2 or more countries increase the size and quality of military resources to gain military and political superiority over one another. Throughout the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union increased the stockpiles of their nuclear weapons, in addition to their conventional ones. They also developed newer and more deadly weapons to compete with the other side. It all started when the US dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan at the end of World War II. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb. In 1952, the US tested its first hydrogen bomb, 1,000 times more powerful than the ones dropped on Japan. Less than a year later, the Soviet Union unveiled their first hydrogen bomb. The United States, throughout the arms race, increased their defense spending by 4 times. It convinced the public that it was necessary due to the fear of the Soviet Union. The US will maintain nuclear superiority to the Soviets until the late 1970s.